Hi Quilty Quilters, I'm Candace Murray with Quilt Studio 940, and in today's video I'm going to show you the basics of how to paper piece. As you can see, I have my fabric lined out, my pattern in hand, so let's get started. I want to point out to you my fabric key. So this is my key that I use while I'm paper piecing to know which fabric goes where. Now it's going to really help you, maybe not so much in the beginning, but once you get to your third or fourth piece, you're going to forget which number was colored, and so this is going to help you tremendously. I have my paper piecing section here. I like to start by folding my paper on these black lines. Place the ruler along your black sew line and gently fold the paper up using your ruler as a guide. I fold the whole paper in that direction, not just the sew line. Okay, there we have it. It's folded. Make sure you fold with the pattern in towards itself. Now we're going to place fabric in the section labeled number 1. I'm going to use my fabric key. My fabric section right here is number 1. Okay, so it's going to be this color. Now, I'm not going to just take my whole big piece of fabric and just cut it up randomly. I'm going to cut this down into more manageable strips. This is going to make it easier to paper piece. So I get a general idea for how big each of my sections are with my big ruler. Looks about like 3 inches. Turn it over to one side of my ruler is inches and the other side measures in 1/2 inches. So we've got 3 inches on this piece, 2 inches here. So I'm going to go ahead and cut my fabric in 3.5 inch segments. And I repeat this process for each color. Now that I have each fabric cut up into nice little strips, I'm going to start with section number 1. Like we just mentioned, it is this color. Okay, so on the back side of my pattern, you can see where I've made all these creases. I am going to put a little piece of double-sided tape in section number 1. Here we go. Now I'm going to lay my fabric down printed side or right side up. Now this fabric looks like a batik, which is a fabric that's printed on both sides. It doesn't have a right or wrong side, but it is actually not. This is a printed fabric. So you can see one side is a lot lighter than the other side. Okay, so again, this goes right side up on the blank side of my paper. So I lay it down, making sure that I've covered section number 1 all the way around by at least 1/4 inch. So now it's stuck. See that? Now that I have fabric number 1 adhered to section number 1, I'm going to fold between sections 1 and 2 along the black sew line. Once I have the fold made, I'm going to trim this piece, leaving a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So here's my 1/4 inch marker on the ruler. Take my rotary blade, cut off the excess. Usually I keep these little pieces just in case they fit later in the pattern. This piece I'm not going to keep. It is definitely too small. And for this little piece number 1, I'm going to fold in between sections 1 and 5 just to cut off this tail of fabric. Set fabric aside. Now I have my fabric trimmed. I am going to fold between sections 1 and 2 and add my color number 2. I can see by my fabric key here that color number 2 is this blue with a lovely little gold accent to it. I always like to have little stacks of cut fabric, and on top of that I put fabric that I've previously cut. This saves a ton of fabric. Okay, fold along the sew line. We're going to line up fabric number 2 along the 1/4 inch cut line of fabric number 1. See, here's my fabric number 1. I'm going to line it up with the edge. Now, to make sure that your fabric fits, the fabric underneath needs to completely cover this folded section number 2. It's a faint fold line. You can see here, this part right here is section number 5. This part right here is another section, number 6. This part right here is my section number 2. So if I kind of pick my fabric up, I can see that it is not going to cover. It comes all the way out to here. My fabric underneath that is not going to cover. So I'm going to reposition my fabric. Let's try it like that. Okay, I've got a little extra here. No worries, we'll cut that off after we get our line sewn. I'm going to lift up my pattern and see that? I have fabric all the way under my section number 2. Once this fabric is folded, that's my guide. That is my sewing guide. I don't have to do math. I don't have to think about how it mirrors. It's done for me. That is my fabric template. Make sure that your fabric overlaps these creases by at least 1/4 inch. After I have it laid down, I'm going to open my fabric up and sew along the black line between pieces number 1 and 2. Bring it over to my sewing machine. Before I start sewing, I'm going to reduce my stitch length to 1 1/2. This will make it so much easier to remove the paper at the end. I do not tie on or tie off. And I go between sections 1 and 2. I don't go into any other sections. This piece has a section 5 that lines up with it and a section 6. I'm not going to sew into those areas. Stop at the end and just cut. Okay. Now I'm going to fold over and cut this fabric that I just added. I'm going to cut it to a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open up our paper pattern, turn over, open up our fabric. Let's iron this seam flat. Here we have it. Now it's time to sew on section 3 up here. Here's my section 1, section 2, and section 3. I'm going to fold on the black sew line in between sections 1 and 3. My crease didn't set. Let's do the crease again. Perfect. Line our ruler up along that cut line, the sew line at a 1/4 inch. Let's see what fabric is number 3 here. Okay, it's this one. Again, I have a few little spare pieces. Let's see if they're big enough. Nope. Nope. So now I've checked. This crease right here is all of my section number 3, and fabric is covering that on the bottom. See, it's right here. So I'm going to take this to the machine and sew along the sew line. Press this seam open. Fold on our subsequent sew lines and remove the excess fabric. Always remember to leave a 1/4 inch here or you won't have a seam allowance and your quilt will open up in the middle. So we just repeat those steps until we have our whole paper covered with fabric. All right, now I have my finished piece. All my sections are covered. All my seams are ironed. Now, I'm going to trim any little loose threads off. I'm going to cut this piece down to the seam allowance that's in the pattern. So this is the written seam allowance. Yay, and we're finished. Here's a little shell piece for my scarab quilt. And in my next video, I'm going to show you how to line up your sections so your points are perfect. Like and subscribe so you won't miss it. Thanks for watching and happy sewing.